Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's press briefing in Amsterdam on public health emergencies. I'm Maria-Agnes Heine, the head of the communication department at the European Medicines Agency. This is the first briefing of this year, and I would like to tell you that in the coming weeks, we will no longer schedule these briefings on a monthly basis, but will invite you to briefings as needed. So today we plan to update you on the latest developments regarding COVID-19 vaccines, the ongoing work to identify a suitable future vaccine strategy, and also provide you with some information on Mpox vaccines. You will then, as usual, have the opportunity to ask questions. I'm happy to welcome our three speakers for today, Dr. Marco Cavalieri, the head of Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy and chair of EMA's Emergency Task Force, ETF, Dr. Georgi Genov, the head of pharmacovigilance, and EMA's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Stefan Tierstrup. The briefing is broadcast via YouTube and Europe by satellite, and you can use the footage free of charge. You will find the respective links in the invite to this briefing. I'm now handing over to EMA's head of Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy, Marco Cavalieri, who will provide you with an update on the developments of the past 2 months. Marco, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this press briefing. Today, I will indeed provide you a brief update on the recent developments linked to our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The good news is that the epidemiological situation in Europe is constantly improving. Overall, the data show a marked decline in the number of new infections, hospitalization, and deaths. And according to the European CDC, these are at the lowest levels observed in the EU in the past 12 months. However, COVID-19 still poses a significant burden on the healthcare system across the European Union. In this context, the low uptake of booster doses among vulnerable groups, such as people 60 years and older, constitutes a concern from a public health perspective. If we look at the whole world, we see that in some countries in the Far East, such as China and Japan, there is still a high circulation of the virus with an important burden in terms of hospitalization and mortality. This is likely related to the lower degree of immunity in the population from vaccination and/or natural exposure. Furthermore, the surveillance data show that the subvariant called XBB 1.5 is currently spreading very rapidly. Currently, XBB 1.5 is present in the EU at low levels. However, it is expected it will become dominant in the EU in the next weeks. Although this subvariant has not caused an excessive burden of disease in other regions such as North America, it is important to not let our guard down as the virus continues to evolve. Therefore, while we welcome the positive epidemiological trends in the EU, we keep monitoring the situation very closely. For this reason, we also encourage every person who belongs to an at-risk group for COVID and has not been revaccinated with an adaptive vaccine to do so. Now, moving to adaptive vaccines. As you know, the EMA's Emergency Task Force has already endorsed the use of adapted messenger RNA bivalent vaccines for primary vaccination in children and adults who have not been vaccinated or nor previously infected. The manufacturers are at the moment preparing their regulatory submissions to request an extension of the marketing authorization of these vaccines in this respect. Moving on to the overall vaccine strategy, the EMA has been looking for some time now into a streamlined approach in terms of vaccine strains and schedule. There are a number of reasons that prompted a reflection from our side. First of all, COVID-19 vaccines for primary vaccination might be limited going forward to the very young kids who are still naive to the virus, while in the remaining age groups, they will be used mostly for booster purposes, as it is expected that either vaccination or natural exposure has occurred in the majority of the population. Secondly, as the virus is continuously evolving, especially with respect to the sequence of the spike protein, which is the antigen contained in the currently available vaccines, there is a need to consider adjustment of vaccines to provide better match against the circulating variants, and or ensure a larger breadth of coverage. And for example, against emerging new subvariants such as XBB 1.5 that I was mentioning earlier, which are immunologically distant from the original SARS-CoV-2 virus and also show an immunological drift from previous Omicron subvariants in terms of ability of the antibodies to neutralize them. The available effectiveness data with adapted COVID-19 vaccines, which targets both the original strain of the virus and an Omicron BA.4/5 strain, is reassuring. It will be important to collect more evidence on the performance of these vaccines and the other vaccine we have available in Europe against the newly circulating subvariants. This data could guide us on the direction to take for future adaptations. A harmonized guidance for all the manufacturers, taking into account the differences in the type of vaccines and the time it would take to adapt them, is needed to maintain an up-to-date armamentarium of vaccines that would confer an adequate breadth of protection against emerging variants. With this objective in mind, we are currently discussing with WHO and international partners, including US FDA and other regulatory agencies, on the criteria and the process that will lead to a potential update of the vaccines in view of future vaccination campaigns. Therefore, we will intensify our international regulatory interactions, and discussions under the umbrella of the ICMRA, which is the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities, are already planned in the spring. While it is true that the virus is not behaving yet as a seasonal endemic respiratory virus, as for example other endemic coronaviruses are doing, we would expect that vaccination campaigns would take place primarily once a year. The best time for this would be at the beginning of the cold season, when other vaccines for respiratory viruses are administered. Therefore, that could be the right moment to consider amendments in the composition of the vaccines. We will keep monitoring emerging data during the coming months to determine the most suitable direction with respect to the composition of the vaccines. Now, moving to what we are assessing right now, we are assessing the protein-based COVID-19 vaccine from IPRA, which is progressing at this moment in time, and we hope to be in the position to conclude soon. We will also keep carrying out the scientific assessment of other vaccines, including those not intended for use in the European Union. We collaborate in this sense closely with WHO with the goal of enabling access to safe and effective vaccine in as many countries as possible around the world. The Emergency Task Force is in contact with developers of mucosal vaccine to see if some of the candidates may be advanced rapidly. We look forward to discussing any emerging data from the mucosal vaccines that have already been deployed in India and China. Besides COVID, we are evaluating a vaccine for RSV, which is the respiratory syncytial virus for older adults. RSV is a common respiratory virus which causes, on average, mild symptoms, but can be serious for baby, small children, and indeed older adults. So there is a need to increase protection in vulnerable groups for other respiratory viruses that might cause waves during winter times. And we are looking at possible recommendation on this specific vaccine in the next months. Now, moving to safety. With regard to the safety of COVID-19 vaccine, we keep monitoring it continuously, and no new issue has been detected that would call into question the safety profile of the vaccines. In January, EMA hosted a workshop on myocarditis with international regulators, academic researchers, as well as the manufacturers of the messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccines. And the aim of the workshop was to put together the current knowledge on this well-known adverse event from different perspectives, and essentially to try to enhance the understanding of its underlying mechanisms. We will consider the possibility to fund additional research to investigate the immunopathological mechanisms and to better define the population who present a higher risk. Also, long COVID is high on our agenda. an increasing number of studies are being published which look into defining the characteristics of long COVID. Some hypotheses are being put forward with regard to the mechanism that trigger it, such as, for example, prolonged viral replication in certain parts of the body. A proper characterization of the burden of disease associated with long COVID and the spectrum of clinical symptoms is the current focus of many researchers. Relevant studies have been already published indicating the positive impact of vaccination and treatment with antivirals in preventing the occurrence of longer-term complications. We are currently engaging with developers to discuss the design of clinical studies that could demonstrate the benefit of specific treatments and what concrete measurable outcomes may look like. Moving to mpox. Allow me to briefly touch upon this, as we were able to assess real-world data on the MVA vaccine, which shows that it is effective, especially after 2 doses. But we still need to gather more evidence on how to use it in the long term and in future vaccination campaigns. Our work does not stop here. Discussions are ongoing with developers of other vaccines for mpox and other similar viruses, and we will continue progressing with this discussion so that we can expand our armamentarium. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to give the floor back to our moderator.
Many thanks, Marco. We will now take questions from the floor, and dear colleagues from the media, please raise your hand if you want to ask a question and turn on your camera. And when I give you the floor, we will unmute your microphone and you can then ask your question. So the first question comes from Reuters, from Natalie Grover. Natalie, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for taking the questions. Could you elaborate a little more on your thinking about the annual vaccine schedule for COVID? You mentioned that there isn't enough evidence to suggest that it's a seasonal virus. I mean, are you expecting that, this annual kind of approach will be akin to what we do every year for the flu? So you kind of look at all the different variants and make an educated guess as to what might work for that year or something else. And secondly, if I may, I just wanted to follow up on the situation with antibiotics. Maybe Dr. Thestrup, you could weigh in on that. We've been seeing antibiotic shortages for a few months now, and I was wondering whether there's been any updates on any easing up of those shortages. You had mentioned earlier that you expected them to sort of come down as spring approaches. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. And I give the first question on whether the seasonal approach would be the right one for COVID-19 vaccines to Marco, please.
Yeah, no, indeed, as said, there are still a lot of uncertainties around this virus, which is still rather new, if I can say so. So therefore, for the time being, we are not seeing yet behaving with really this type of winter waves, which normally is what happens with these respiratory viruses, at least in temperate climates. But first of all, we would expect that this might be the direction it would be going. And therefore, it still looks like the type of flu paradigm approach would make sense as a starting point to think about when would be the best timing for changing the composition of the vaccines against this virus. Of course, if something happens in between that would demonstrate a sudden and unpredictable change in the viral composition that would cause an increased burden of disease, we will have to think about that. And we would have to come up with some additional measures. But overall, we do think that it's reasonable to think in the direction of the flu paradigm, notwithstanding all the uncertainties that we have at this point in time. And also thinking that, repeated vaccination might not be accepted in the population in general, and therefore it would be better to consider, timing the vaccination once a year and maybe synchronizing them with vaccination for other respiratory viruses.
Thank you very much, Marco. And regarding the second question on the status of the shortages of antibiotics, I give the floor to Dr. Stefan Tierstrup. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the question. I think we previously briefed that in terms of shortages of antibiotics, and in particular amoxicillin and amoxicillin with clavulanic acid, 28 out of 30 European Economic Area countries are reporting shortages. That's, of course, shortages in every kind of, from severe to less severe shortages. That number still stands. 28 countries are still affected. But there is some feedback, positive feedback, that the demand for antibiotics is actually decreasing because the number of infections are going down as we move into the spring. So I would say some status quo and some light improvements on the demand side.
Thank you very much, Stefan. The next question comes from Helen Collis from Politico. Helen, please go ahead.
Thank you. Could you update us on where things stand in the development of the COVID and flu combination shots, and if we're likely to have any of those rolled out in time for the next seasonal flu season next autumn? And then secondly, I wondered if you could comment on avian flu, what work, if any, the EMA human medicines experts are doing with regards to monitoring that, and if any discussions are happening looking at potential species crossover or any potential treatments or vaccines, if needed, in avian flu in the human population. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. The first one, Marco, was on COVID flu combination shots.
Yeah, indeed, of course, this is important. And as you know, there are some developers that are thinking about having vaccines that would combine COVID-19 and influenza. Of course, we have been very much open to discuss these programs, and we look forward if indeed this type of combination could be an effective way forward in having in a single shot giving protection for both type of viruses. Studies are currently ongoing, so we will look at all this evidence and we will consider as soon as we can whether this vaccine could be approved. At this point in time, however, I would say it's a bit early for us to say whether there will be any chance that this vaccine could be approved before the next autumn. That's very difficult to say at this stage.
Thank you very much. The second question was also for you on avian flu and what the agency is doing about it.
Yeah, of course, we are monitoring very closely what is happening because we see something rather atypical with this infection propagating also in mammals. And of course, you know, we are liaising also with the European CDC and other public health authorities to really understand what is going on. At this point, all I can say is that beside monitoring really closely the epidemiology, we have to consider what is our portfolio of options here, either for prevention via vaccines. And just to remind you, we got some vaccines approved for avian influenza, essentially based on the H5N1 strain. And this vaccine could possibly be used in case there is a significant spillover to humans. Also, we got a number of antivirals that will be effective as well against influenza, different type of influenza A, and therefore could also be an additional way of curbing down what could be the effective of these type of viruses, if ever they will spread to human. Because I think, despite, you know, this overall context of spreading in animals, including mammals, the good thing is that we are not seeing so many cases so far that has been spilling over to humans.
Thank you very much. So I don't see any more questions right now. So unless any of the speakers today wants to complement anything and say anything in addition, I would like to close today's press conference. So thank you very much for your interest in the topics presented. And I also want to thank today's speakers. And as mentioned at the beginning, we do not know yet when the next briefing on the ongoing public health emergencies will take place, but we will send you an invite as soon as we know. And as always, if you have any questions in the meantime, please do not hesitate to follow up with the press office. Thanks again for today and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.